Okay, welcome everyone to the third in this series of creative practice research seminars that I'm running on behalf of the Creative Practice Network at Mexico and Southampton Solent University. My name is Dr. Roy Hannay. I'm an Associate Professor of Media Practice at Solent University, and these seminars have come out of discussions at the Practice Network and where I work with a lot of early career researchers trying to understand how you articulate what they do as practitioners as research in an academic context. And I think that that's really what a lot of the questions that we're asking in the series is really just how do you contextualize practice, creative practice? How do you contextualize it as research in an academic setting? So I don't pretend to be an expert in any of this, which is why I've invited some experts in to help us understand it all. So I'm going to I'm going to ask Dr. Lyle Skains to introduce herself, and then we're going to have a bit of a free-form conversation for about 45 minutes, a little bit of Q&A, and then we'll wrap up around about 50 minutes so that we don't waste everyone's time when it's nearly tea time. If you do have questions, put them in the chat and we will pick them up at the end. Please leave your microphones off and we will start. So, welcome, Dr. Lyle Skains.
Thank
Would
you.
you like to introduce yourself, give yourself a self-introduction and explain to everyone why you are the person best placed to discuss this topic?
Yeah, my name is Lyle, she, her, and I am an associate professor in literary media or health and science communication, depending on who you're talking to and what day it is at Bournemouth University. And my areas, and there are multiple areas of interest in research, primarily is in interactive digital storytelling. So I'm a creative digital writer. So I create stories that you can play, usually online and quite often for health and science communication purposes. So conveying things like climate change education and campaigns that help people remember how to take medications and things like that. Um, and a lot of my interest in it has been in the practice-based side. So I actually create these things, and I'm very interested in how that process works. I'm also interested in publishing and new paradigms of publishing for in sort of a digital world and with digital media. And so a lot of my work is based in doing a creative thing, doing a publishing thing, and then seeing what comes out of it. I'm very interested in what happens to the creator. So cognitive processes are really interesting to me. And so I've established some models thinking about how we work as creative practitioners when we work. And digging into that and then thinking about effects on the work of introducing new things. So when I came to my research, I was a prose writer writing short stories and novels and hadn't really worked in digital media before. And so I was interested in how that changed not only me, but the work itself. Like, how would it change the type of stories that I wrote and the structures of the stories and that sort of thing? What elements went into that? So from that, I developed a creative practice method because at the time I was doing my PhD, there's a lot of talk about practice-based research being relevant and being good, but not a lot of discourse on how to do it. Like, how do you actually engage in it, and how do you incorporate these things? And then post PhD, now it's a lot of, how do we work this in as researchers? How do we publish this stuff? How do we, report to the ref what we're doing, what goes in, and how does it get counted, as it were? And then how do we bid for grants doing practice-based research? Um, so, when you're putting in for things like UKRI, it's the same sort of, it's the other side of that coin, the ref coin, is we have to show what we're getting out of it and how it's not just public engagement. It's not just an illustration of what's coming out. Um, yeah, I'm getting a weird echo. I saw you on that.
Someone came in with a microphone on.
Yeah, but yeah, it's also we need to think about how we're building it into projects from the start. So thinking about all the whole picture, the holistic picture of our research and our practice and how we can incorporate that so that we're not tacking things on and we're not put on projects just to do a little song and dance of arts for the real quote unquote researchers. And yeah, so that's some stuff that I explore, and I'll plug my book on designing and doing practice-based research projects, which is aimed at undergraduates, but I think a lot of master's and PhD students who are kind of new to practice-based research and what their projects need to do have found it useful as well. I'll happily put some links in the chat later. But yeah, that's me, and
Right?
that's why I'm here.
Yeah, please do share that link with us. So I think you kind of touched on one of the issues that I think is important to understand is that when we're doing creative practice in academia, the need to articulate it rather than it just being research, we have to articulate it as research, and part of that is that drive to, when we're applying for funding or when we're reporting on projects, there is a sense that this is public money, so you really need to evidence value worth. The word impact gets bandied around a lot, and I think that really does, for me, kind of contextualizes why these conversations are important. So one of the models that, and this is the model that I want to really focus on today for working through some of these issues, is often referred to as a theory of change model. And in brief, it's a method for planning impact and then retrospectively designing the project to lead towards impact. Could you outline what your understanding of the model is, and just give us a general overview of what it is and why it's beneficial?
Yeah, I think I think the reason that theory of change was sort of introduced and um has been placed had such importance placed on it is a lot of times as researchers we kind of go, oh, we're going to do this thing because it's interesting, and then it'll be out there and it'll change the world. It's a little bit like, I don't know if anybody's a South Park fan, but in like the very early seasons of South Park, they introduced the concept of underpants gnomes. And underpants gnomes, their job was to steal your underpants, the underpants that disappear in the wash, that sort of thing. And their whole plan was profit. Step one was steal all the underpants. Step two, who knows? Step three, profit. And I feel like a lot of our research is that step two. We're going to change the world with our research. We're going to change how people do things with our research. It's going to be important to other writers and practitioners and artists because it'll change how they think about their work. But we never really articulate how that will happen, like how we're going to reach them or how we're going to change thinking or how it's going to be implemented as policy or all these sorts of things. um so theory of change is really saying, okay, we want to change a thing, we want to have an effect, this is the effect that we want to have, and we're actually going to lay out that step two instead of just putting the little shrug icon in there. We are going to say how this is going to work. So, for instance, in a project I did called UNCO2, which is a climate change education project, we said we want young people to understand climate change and understand that, sure, individual actions have effect, but also they need to think about the larger picture and how they can put pressure on governments and corporations and things like that. And so, how are we going to do this? We're going to go into secondary schools. We're going to teach workshops. We're going to reach them on an emotional level, on an identity level, on a sort of a personal level through storytelling and this sort of thing. And we're going to measure it. We're going to see if this has an effect. And so that was a research project that we put together going, okay, we wanted to have positive behavior change in the world, and we put together something that was a method to get there. And so basically, it is filling in that step number two. Um, sure, you can steal all the underpants and you can want profit in the end, but if you don't know how you're getting from stealing underpants to taking everybody's money, it's you just wind up with a pile of underpants.
I think that's a great metaphor, actually. I think that we should move.
There's a song that goes along with it, but I won't sing it.
So I think, I mean, I'm interested in having kind of, I guess I wouldn't say that I use the formal methodology and approach. There is a methodology and approach. You can Google it. There are key steps. There are, workflows, flow charts, all of that stuff. What do you think are the things that you can't let go of? What are the principles that you have to adopt, and what do they look like in terms of concrete actions?
I think the key things is that there are measurements and indicators that are helpful. And I think that's where UK research has been moving with the REF, and it initially brought in this notion of impact and the differentiation from impact and public engagement, and that sort of thing, which is that they've been pushing and pushing and pushing for research to be less esoteric, to be less about researchers talking to a lot of other researchers and having a big, researcher party with all of our outcomes and the old notion that, you put a research output out there and the two or three other people who are in your specific niche for your research, they read it, they get a big laugh out of it or hate you for it or whatever it is, but that's all it is. And in UK research, and I think worldwide research, as economic issues have become pressing and we have global challenges and things like that, is they want a better connect between those of us who are pushing knowledge forward and the rest of the world that needs to take this knowledge and put it into implementation, whether it's to bring better rights to girls and women worldwide, or to resolve some economic inequalities, or whatever it is, that there needs to be that connection. And in order for to convince anybody of anything, you kind of need to, at this point, overwhelm them. Looking at a research paper at this point is, most people can't. I mean, we can't even really read and understand research papers that are in disciplines that aren't ours. Forget about it if you're a policymaker, if you're a member of the public, et cetera, et cetera. So, being able to put things into forms and numbers that not only show what you've done, but are persuasive and on that level. So whether it's measurements of, here's the attitudes of these people before we started, and here's the attitudes after. Here's how clean the water was before we started, and here's how clean it was after. But also, learning how to communicate better, learning how to communicate through methods that are effective. Which is really easy for a writer to say. But even writers tend to be not great at meeting specific audience needs. So those sorts of things, I think, are the key elements, which is to think about where the work is going and who it's going to affect and how you need to reach them. Which I
Yeah.
think for a lot of us is, when we do our PhDs, they're all for us. They're all for this very tiny, tiny little niche. It's all very internal. And then they just suddenly expect us to know all the rest of it and to turn it externally and know how it's going to be implemented and that sort of thing. And it's a big jump to make.
So you talked a little bit about how the theory of change approaches about identifying that long-term change that you want to achieve. And of course, one of the big challenges of doing creative practice projects, especially most of us will be doing projects that are funded. So at the end of the funding, there's no more money. But the impact may not happen until further down the line. And so one of the ways that the indicators that we build into the project, having identified the impact, the goal, long-term goal, the indicators are often talked about as indicators of pathways to impact. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? What's the difference between a pathway to impact and impact?
So, this is a really good question, because we struggle with this, right? Impact case studies for the ref, which is kind of where we originate this whole notion of formalized impact, yada yada. Um, we have a certain time period where we're reporting things in the ref for publication. So I think for the next one, it's publications post 2022. Don't quote me on that. But it's the more recent stuff, right? They don't want us going all the way back to 2000 for that one paper that, made a big impact, and we're just going to live on that, coast on that for the rest of our careers. But with impact, it does have more longevity. So it can be based on work published prior to the current period, and as if it's still ongoing. So they are really interested in long-term impact as it develops. And for some people, it's a ways off. So you have to identify those pathways when you put in for funding. So pathways is sort of when I think when most of the impact is still in front of you, in the future. So you are trying to identify how you are going to carry out impact. And there are separate funding schemes and things like that. And that's honestly been where most of my funding success has been in, is going, oh, I did this thing. Now can I turn it into better impact? And so there's, where I can do, um, extra stuff based on that. And so the actual impact may take a while to develop, but it's important when you put a grant proposal together to be thinking about that from the start. So impact officers and all the workshops and things will talk about um, embedding impact into research projects and integrating it in. And I think that that's a brilliant idea, because an impact isn't just, oh, I changed somebody's mind or people made some comments. You can do impact in really creative ways. So for the UNCO2 project, that I will use as an example many, many times, we built actual impact into the research project. So there were layers of the research project. So when we put together these workshops that we were going to be delivering to kids in secondary schools, we were researching, does this series of workshops based in this model, it was a specific pedagogical model. It involved interactive digital narrative, which we had theories about why interactive digital narrative would be effective for introducing attitude and behavioral change. Um, and so we said our research is, does this series of workshops make a difference? Does it change attitudes and then behavior in the students who go through the workshops? And then we had social science methods to study that. So ethnographic methods, surveys, and that sort of thing that we did with the students before and after, and to measure attitude. But the impact was also there in that simply by doing the workshops, our stakeholders, which were the students and even the teachers and the parents, were impacted. They got better insights into the research that we were doing. So they got better insights into what climate change is and how they can affect the world on it, and that sort of thing. Um, and so it was all sort of built in from the start, so that we were doing more than one thing throughout. And it's not always possible to do that with a project. Projects where you involve stakeholders are really the projects where you can build impact in from the ground up. So it's things like if you're thinking about a particular group that you want to reach, we do creative stuff with youth groups and charity organizations and things like that, where we can involve people from the start in a creative project. That's something that has impact at the same time you're doing the research. Um, and that is that helps with several areas of a grant proposal, which says, oh, I've already got some pathways to impact in here. I've got stakeholders that are involved in the research from the ground up. I've got project partners in that, it's the local, we've done things with like the gym that we go to. So some of it is not, oh, you have all these magical network connections. It's I talked to a guy at my gym and now and he was like, "Yeah, I'll put up a poster if you design a poster that incorporates multiple body types because we want to be more inclusive and see how that, affects people." So that's a project partner. You write a letter for him and get him to sign it. Um, so yeah, there's lots of different ways, and we're creative people. We can think about ways to build that in. But it's helpful to think, okay, how could this project have impact, and how will I measure it
Yeah.
from the very beginning? So even if that impact's going to happen in, a ways in the future, you know what you're going to do. You know what you're going to try to measure to see what the impact is.
I think one of the attractions to the pathways to impact thing for me is that if someone does something as part of your project, has some kind of experience, you can absolutely measure that. Whereas it's a lot harder to measure the long-term impact.
Mhm.
So I've just done a project in Portsmouth that aimed to try to shift the sort of pro-environmental behavior. And the way I described it to the people I was working with is if when people come through this experience, they do one small thing that makes maybe puts one little P on the shelf, and then next year they might do something that adds another P and then another P, and eventually that creates mass, which is when the impact turns. So, and I think that the pathways to impact is nice because it acknowledges that it won't necessarily be just you and just your project which creates the change, but that you are laying in foundations for change. And that's the way I conceive of it. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the UNCO2 project, while we had impact that was built into the project itself and in, the student attitudes and that sort of thing. Um, but then there were things that came along that I didn't anticipate, which is I wound up uh building in an annual conference, creative symposium. I call it an unconference into the New Media Writing Prize, which is always centered on things that the UNCO2 project inspired. So building interactive digital narratives for social good. Usually that's our shorthand for addressing the UN sustainability challenges. And so every year we have 2 days where people talk about works and create works and share works that are designed to bring attention to the sustainability challenges, to work toward impacting and reducing issues and things like that. And so, but I was thinking of that, and the inspiration for doing that was the UNCO2 project. So from that has built on, and then it fed into the New Media Writing Prize with a new category to award those types of works and that sort of thing. So it builds and builds and builds, and you start seeing the different ways that these things are coming about in the world. And so there's that network thing. But if I didn't already know that I had done this project, and that's why I thought about doing it over here, and now I've got this many people participating in that sort of thing, and they're saying these things, then I wouldn't be able to build that into the impact. So
So
yeah, that foundation there as a catch-all is good.
that was a really good intro into defining these terms: outputs, outcomes, and impact, because they appear to have very, very distinct meanings in the context of creative practice research, and certainly within the context of a theory of change. And I think it's really worth just going, talking one by one and saying, what is an output, what is an outcome, and why are those things different from impact? Because our projects probably, when we having defined our end goal and gone back and started to design the project, look at the indicators, we need to be thinking about whether this activity generates an output, an outcome, or is a pathway to impact. It might be all of those things, but it doesn't necessarily always need to be all of those things. Do you want to start with outputs? What are outputs?
Outputs to me, and hopefully I'm correct on this. Maybe that's why grant proposals get rejected. I don't know. Outputs to me are the tangible outputs of outputs. I'm going to define the word by using the word. The things that actually you can point to that resulted from the project. So to me, and examples of outputs are the creative artifact that you create. If you're a painter, it's a painting. If you're writing a novel, it's the novel. It might be a journal article. It might be a book. It might be an event. So for me, the unconference is not only an example of that I can draw impact material from, but it's an output because it's an event. It's something I can identify and point to as this resulted from this project. So it really is when you can list the things, it's the concrete things that we can point to that resulted from the project, from the research, that sort of thing. For me, that's outputs.
And so how are outcomes different then?
For me, outcomes are it's a little bit like the difference between aims and objectives. Whereas aims are the more abstract or goal-oriented things, the objectives or the tangible outcomes outputs that come out of the project. So the outcomes are things like we changed minds or we successfully implemented this. So like for the UNCO2 project, where an output is the series of workshop, the teacher's pack, the journal articles that we wrote, the book that we wrote, the interactive digital narrative, that sort of thing. The outcomes are X number of teachers took on the teacher's pack and taught it in their classrooms. The outcomes are we showed that there was a positive change in attitude amongst these students around climate change and what they could do. So they're less tangible, and outcomes are usually conveyed or presented in outputs. But outcomes are that sort of more abstract of this is what we got out of this project. Sometimes it's findings, sometimes it's that sort of thing. But to me, it's that sort of, oh, I want people to learn this, and people learned it. So that's the outcome.
Okay, yeah. So it's a bit more it's difficult to define, isn't it? Because I don't want to say that it's like short-term impact, but it's the things that have kind of benefited from, or the value that's come out of those outputs, isn't it,
Hmm.
really? So as you said, I think, how many people are actually using that pack that the
Hmm.
output is. So I think we've probably already covered this, but anyway, let's do it anyway. So you've got outputs, you've got outcomes, you've got impacts. Let's really talk about what a project impact might be.
I think an impact is where you can honestly say that there has been a change in the world, whether small, on a small scale within, one person in parliament say, presenting a bill or something based on your work, or change in attitudes or minds or understanding. So I'll belabor the UNCO2 project. For us, an output is the teacher's pack that we put together so that teachers could take the whole program, slot it right into their curriculum, and go. So that's an output. The outcome is we have this new model of teaching climate change education, incorporating science, technology, engineering, arts, and all the STEM plus arts. So it's a STEAM project. Um, that in this new model and that incorporates interactive digital narrative. So that's an outcome. The output is, like I said, the teacher's pack. The impact then, sure, the teachers are downloading it and using it, but the impact is, does it work? Are they feeding back to us that the students really engaged and a student started a campaign on campus as a result to do X? So we like to gather that feedback and comments. So, and one thing that we did was, in order for teachers to access this freely available open access teaching pack, we've put it behind a Google form where they tell us, you know, what school they're at and what they're using it for, that sort of thing in their email, so that we can contact them and say, did you use this? Can we help you with anything? How did it work for you? And we can see, did it have an actual impact in the classroom? Did the students take it on board? Did the teacher find it useful as a teaching thing? And so it changed their pedagogy. So those are the sorts of things that we can then pull back and put in an impact case study or something like that. Obviously, it's not going to go, and it might also be a research outcome. We might also say, yes, this, by doing this research, we changed these students' attitudes, and here are, our qualitative findings on that. But also, it is also an example of impact when, in that case, part of the goal of the research was to have impact. And so that sort of thing that takes a little bit more time to develop, as you say.
Mm.
And so it's helpful to have those things in place, knowing that that would be an impact thing to say,
Yeah.
okay, we're going to see where this is going.
And the challenge here is not everyone is going to be in a position to capture impact,
Exactly.
especially if you've got an Arts Council funded project that's over and done. The one I'm doing is just about to be wrapped up, and I'm going to report it to the Arts Council. As far as they're concerned, done. They're not really, they might do impact evaluations, but they're not going to come and do an impact evaluation on my project in 5 years' time just to check whether there's been an impact. So building in that sense of pathways to impact is kind of crucial, I think. We're kind of coming towards the end here, and I've got two questions for you. The first one is there anything that you want to share that we haven't covered, that you think might be useful for creative practice researchers thinking about a theory of change approach to the project design?
I think that I see that there's a question in the chat about embedding impact into a practice research project when you say write a novel. Um, you know, I think it's important to remember not all projects have to have impact. It is okay if especially when it's practice-based research and it's very exploratory, you don't know what you're going to get out of writing that novel until you write it. So it's very hard to say, oh, by writing this novel, I'm going to learn X about the creative process, and I'll be able to tell that to all the other future novelists. And well, you don't know if you're going to learn anything at all. So, it's hard to build those pathways in sometimes. So it's okay if you maybe aren't sure, or if it doesn't have impact at all. There's a reason why for the ref, everybody's got to, submit outputs, but not everyone has to submit impact. And because it does take time to develop, and some projects and disciplines even just don't lend themselves that way. And sometimes you don't have sufficient funding, as you note, to follow up on the impact. Like UNCO2, we really wanted to do longitudinal studies where we see not only the impacts on the attitudes directly after the workshops, but 3 months later, 6 months later, a year later. And we've had students doing this now for 6 years. So we could say 6 years later, now that they're adults and they can vote and they can, march and protest and things like that. But we never got funding for that. So we couldn't do that. So it's okay if there's stuff that you don't capture. It's okay if you don't have a bank of quotes from people saying this was useful or this wasn't or what have you. Not all projects will be that neat and tidy in terms of outputs and outcomes and impact, and that's okay. But it's important that when you do have something that lends itself in that sort of direction, that you're thinking about it from the start and don't go, oh dang, they really liked this. I sure wish we'd had a way to capture, their responses on this because that would be really useful. And it's just impossible to do after the fact. So
I think often when people are talking about theory of change, they are talking about impacts in social impacts, for example. Writing a novel might have a social impact, but it might be that impact is in you and your life and how, your skill. Being a novel writer, for example, might be getting published. You never know. Is that being published? Would that be an outcome, wouldn't it, though, rather than an impact?
yeah, that's interesting. I think, yeah, for me, that would be an outcome. And then say Hugh Howey was a practice-based researcher. So Hugh Howey wrote the Wool series, which has now been turned into the Apple TV series Silo. And when he wrote the first installment of that, he wrote a novella, the first bit. Um, yeah, exactly. Show that then the novel has had this outro. So in doing the self-publishing for Wool, his practice was I write a thing, I publish it. I write the next thing, I publish it. I write the next thing, I publish it. And so he was like three projects down the line when Wool all of a sudden picked up and people started there was 1 month where he just went whoa, all of a sudden it hit that critical mass and people were downloading it like crazy and he went okay, I'm going to go back and write some more stuff. And so he wrote the whole compendium then, and actually it changed how people were talking about self-publishing. He actually changed how publishing happened, because he was able then, when the royalty publishers picked it up, he retained his digital rights. So he kept all the royalties from the ebooks went straight to him. It did not go through his royalty publisher. And he was the very first one to do that. And it established a template that other writers could then follow. That's impact.
Mhm.
So not only did he get it published, but he changed how publishing worked
Mhm.
by what he did.
So I think that's a really, really good example. Um, and I think looking at that question again, I might be tempted to say, well, and taking on board what you've just said, you don't necessarily know what the impact is going to be. You might, when you're writing the application, say, well, it would be good if the impact is X, Y, and Z. But I think when you're doing the kind of research writing or doing something that is a bit more solo, you can still capture the process. And I think that as researchers, it's important just to capture and document the process, even if that is just keeping all your rough notes or research or just sticking it away in a folder. That stuff is all really, really valuable data for you to later look at. And it's this is perhaps where we need to think about indicators slightly differently. If I'm going in doing a project with a load of young people from Motivate South or something like that, to where I'm sat at home doing something myself, we can still capture evidence of the process that we can then reflect on later, because we all, in pretty much most of our work, we will generate materials that aren't necessarily the output, but are part of the process of generating the output. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's super important. It's the documentary method of interpretation, which I think goes all the way back to when they originally first started talking about ethnographical methods and that sort of thing, which is that memory is fallible and there are things that happen in your process and in a project even, that that later on you'll go, oh, but we got to this point. Well, where did that even come from? Why did we do this?
Mhm.
Why was that important? And if you've got that documentation there, it's really useful. It's been really useful in my research outcomes to be able to go, does this story do this? And then you go back and go, oh, I watched Rashomon this week. That's why there's 5 different perspectives in there. I thought that was really cool. Um, and so yeah, I am a big fan of documentation, note-taking, voice notes, um and scribbles in the margins, all those sorts of things I think are really valuable, not just for impact and being able to say, oh, yeah, somebody said this about this or this reaction was this, but also for research outcomes.
And they are, you could think of all of those things as indicators,
Hmm. Yeah,
indicators of change, indicators of process,
absolutely.
indicators of pathways to impact. So, okay, so I have one last question for you. I don't know where this is going to go because it might just completely fall flat. But recently, I've been people keep talking to me about the creative impact process. Have you come across this term or this approach?
Mm-mm. I would love to hear the context and the definition.
Well, I'm told that it's a proprietary system or process devised by this organization, World Pencil. But then I've heard the phrase used in other contexts as well. So I wonder how proprietary it is. And actually, I wonder whether it's actually just theory of change with a logo.
That sounds about right.
So, but I've just put in a funding application to run a creative impact process project. So I thought I might ask and see if anyone knows what it is. So we're going to
Impact.
find out because we're going to pay, if we get the money, we're going to pay someone from World Pencil to come and train us to do this process.
It says the coming together of arts, education, and sustainable development.
Yeah, it's
Um,
generally linked to the UN sustainability goals,
yes,
but
there's some
but
very like
creative
buzzword
responses. Yeah,
thingies like synergies and
yeah, yeah.
inclusive growth opportunities and
Great funding application language. So,
exactly.
has anyone got any questions? If you'd like to pop questions into uh, the chat, yeah, impact. Nicole says impact would be where you can show that your novel has changed people's attitude. Would be for an example. Yes, absolutely. Or a feeling. I think sometimes feelings or affect, as
Mhm.
we often use this word, is if you can change that, that's really, really powerful, isn't it? I had a conversation today with someone about affect in immersive experiences and how it shifts the change from a cognitive change to a kind of emotional
Mm,
cognitive change, and that can be really, really powerful if you can do that.
yeah,
The
absolutely.
Holy Grail.
Um,
So we don't have any questions coming up. So I'm going to say thank you, Lyle. This has been a really
Absolutely.
interesting conversation. Um, go and read Lyle's book. I'll make sure it's definitely been linked in the chat, and I'll add a link to it when I upload this to YouTube and add it to the page. Do check out the website. We've already got 2 more seminars coming up. One on doing your PhD by prior publication by practice. So, kind of, how do you do a PhD backwards, in effect? We've got another one on speculative research and the idea that, and that very much came out of people saying to me, but what's your research question? I'm going, I don't know, I'm doing the research to find out what the research question is. And I think that's an approach that's very common in creative practice that is maybe less common, less familiar to those with the more scientific sort of headset. And then finally, we're going to do one on peer review, which I'm trying to set up at the moment. So please do check the website, sign up, and I will see you at the next one. Thank you, Lyle. I will see you soon, I hope.
yes. Thanks,
Okay.
Roy.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.